The 50th anniversary gala of Callaway Industries was the kind of event that made Manhattan feel like it had been built specifically for this night. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom had been transformed over 3 days by an event design firm that charged $400,000 for exactly this kind of transformation. Every surface considered, every detail intentional, the kind of room that makes people feel the moment they walk into it, that they are witnessing something that will be talked about for years. 300 crystal pendants hung from the ceiling at varying heights, each one catching the light from the 12 chandeliers and throwing it back in fragments across the walls, the tables, the faces of the 300 guests who had been arriving since 7 o'clock in their black cars and their best clothes, carrying the specific energy of people who know they have been invited to something significant. The tables were set with ivory linen and centerpieces of white orchids and dark foliage that the florist had described, in the event brief, as power botanicals, which was a phrase that meant nothing and cost a great deal. The Bordeaux was a 2014 Chateau Margaux that Marcus Callaway had been saving in the climate-controlled cellar of his Greenwich estate for an occasion worthy of it. The food was extraordinary. The string quartet had transitioned at 8 o'clock to a jazz ensemble that played at exactly the right volume, present enough to fill the room, quiet enough not to interrupt the conversations of people conducting business in the language of social occasion. At the head table, in the chair that had been placed, not accidentally, because nothing at a Callaway family event was ever accidental. At the precise center, Marcus Callaway sat with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own mythology. He was 68 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered in the way of men who were once physically powerful and have aged into a kind of architectural solidity, wearing a black Brioni tuxedo that had been made for him in Naples and a Patek Philippe Nautilus on his left wrist that caught the light every time he lifted his champagne flute, which was often. He was happy tonight. Genuinely, visibly, completely happy in the way that men like Marcus Callaway are happy when the story they have been telling about themselves for 50 years is being celebrated in a room full of the people whose opinion they value most. 2 seats to his right sat Derek Callaway, 34 years old. His father's jaw, his mother's ease, a custom Tom Ford tuxedo in midnight black, a watch that was almost as good as his father's. He was telling a story to the couple to his right, something about a deal he had been working on, delivered with the self-deprecating charm of a man who knows the room is on his side and is generous enough to pretend it might not be. He laughed at his own punchline before he delivered it. The couple laughed with him. Across the table, someone refilled his wine. For seats from the end of the head table, in the chair that occupied the specific position of neither prominence nor banishment, the chair of careful management, the chair that said you are family but not the point, sat Serena Callaway, 37 years old, 3 years older than her brother. The fact of those 3 years had been treated, for the entirety of her life, as a technicality rather than a distinction, which told you everything you needed to know about the family system that had produced both of them. She was wearing a midnight blue Roland Mouret column dress that fit with the precision of something made for her body specifically, her dark hair pinned back at the base of her neck, her makeup understated in the way of women who understand that understatement is its own form of authority. Her champagne flute sat untouched in front of her. Her hands rested in her lap. She was very still. Not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion, but the stillness of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment for a very long time and has just heard the starting bell. On the table beside her champagne flute, almost invisible against the ivory linen, was a small silver remote control. Her assistant Daniel had confirmed at 6:45 that evening, while the catering staff was still setting tables and the florist was making final adjustments to the power botanicals, that it was synced to the ballroom's presentation system. The projector was live. The screen at the front of the room was ready. The drive in her evening bag contained a single file. She had been carrying it for 7 months and she intended, before this evening was over, to show it to every person in this room. She was waiting for her father to say the words. He said them at 9:17. Marcus Callaway rose from his chair at the head table with the unhurried confidence of a man who has been the most important person in every room he has entered for 30 years, and he buttoned his jacket, and he accepted the microphone from the event coordinator with a nod, and he looked out at 300 people, investors, board members, industry peers, society acquaintances, 2 journalists from financial publications who had been invited specifically to cover this moment. And he smiled the smile of a man delivering the culmination of his life's work. 50 years, he said. The room quieted with the immediate, total attention of an audience that has been waiting for this. 50 years ago, my father handed me a failing machine parts operation in Pittsburgh and told me it was mine to do with as I chose. He did not tell me it would take 30 years and cost me more than I knew I had to give. He did not tell me there would be nights when I genuinely did not know if we would survive the next quarter. He paused. The room was completely silent. But here we are. $2.8 billion in annual revenue. 12 states. 460 employees who build things that actually matter. He lifted his champagne flute. We built something real. And tonight I want to tell you who is going to carry it forward. He turned. He looked at Derek with the warm, certain pride of a man who has decided something long ago and never revisited the decision. Derek, my son, my vision for this company, my drive, my instinct for what this business needs, I see all of it in him. Everything Callaway Industries is, everything it is going to become, it belongs to Derek now. He is the future of this family and this company. He raised his glass higher. To Derek Callaway. To the next 50 years. 300 people raised their glasses. To Derek, the room said, and drank. And the applause began rolling from the front tables toward the back like a wave that had been building for exactly this shore. Derek stood. He buttoned his jacket. He smiled the smile of a man receiving something he has always been told was already his, and has never seriously questioned whether it should be. He nodded with the modesty of a man performing modesty. Candace, his wife, put her hand on his arm. The photographers moved in. At the far end of the head table, Serena Holloway picked up the small silver remote. She stood. She smoothed the front of her Roland Mouret dress with one hand. And she walked, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who owns the floor beneath their feet and has no need to announce it, toward the presentation stage at the front of the room. Her father saw her moving. The smile on his face did not disappear, but it shifted, something uncertain moving through it, quickly suppressed. Serena, he said it into the microphone that was still live, so the entire room heard it. Sweetheart, we're in the middle of. I know, she said. Her voice was pleasant. Completely, entirely, dangerously pleasant. I just want to add something small. A clarification. She reached the presentation laptop on the side table beside the stage. She inserted the drive. She looked up at 300 people, her parents' world, her brother's audience, the room that had been arranged around a story she was about to permanently revise, and she said in the clear, carrying voice she had been using in boardrooms since she was 30 years old, my father just introduced Derek as the future of Callaway Industries, and I want to make sure everyone in this room has accurate information before the evening goes any further. She pressed the button. The screen behind her, 12 feet wide, blazing white in the darkened front of the ballroom, populated with a single document. The header read, Callaway Industries Incorporated Schedule 13D, Beneficial Ownership Disclosure, filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Below it, in the column marked Controlling Shareholder, in type large enough to be read clearly from the back row of 300 guests, was a single name, Serena and Callaway, 51.3%. The room did not make a sound for 5 full seconds. Then it made every sound at once. But to understand how Serena Holloway arrived at that projector with 51.3% of a $2.8 billion industrial conglomerate legally in her name, to understand the 9 years of silent, surgical, completely invisible preparation that made this moment possible, and the 37 years of being managed into the margins of a room she was born in that made it necessary, you have to go back much further than the Schedule 13D. You have to go back to a kitchen table in Pittsburgh, and a girl who was 12 years old, reading her father's quarterly reports because the numbers were interesting, and interest for Serena Holloway had always been its own sufficient reason for doing anything. Marcus Callaway had built Callaway Industries from a regional industrial components operation that his own father had run into the ground through a combination of bad timing, worse decisions, and the specific stubbornness of a man who confused pride with strategy. When Marcus inherited it at 31, inherited is too generous a word. He received it the way you receive a bill you didn't incur. The company had 11 employees, 2 clients, and debt that was, relative to its revenue, almost artistic in its proportions. What Marcus had, in exchange for the debt and the dysfunction, was an understanding of industrial manufacturing that came from having grown up inside one, and a capacity for sustained, focused, merciless work that was, in the assessment of everyone who encountered him in those early years, genuinely extraordinary. He worked 16-hour days for the first 5 years. He personally managed every client relationship, every supplier negotiation, every hiring decision. He made calls at 6 in the morning and returned emails at midnight and drove himself to plant visits in 3 states because he did not yet have the cash flow to hire a director of operations and because, frankly, he did not yet trust anyone else to see what he was seeing. By the time Serena was born, a Tuesday in February, delivered while Marcus was completing a supplier negotiation in Cleveland that he considered important enough to finish before driving the 4 hours back to Pittsburgh. The company had 40 employees and its first profitable year. By the time she was 5, it had 120 employees and a contract with a regional automotive manufacturer that would anchor its revenue for the next decade. By the time she was 12 and sitting at the kitchen table with his quarterly reports, it had become something real, not yet what it would become, but unmistakably, undeniably on its way. She had found the quarterly reports in his briefcase one Saturday morning when he had left for the office and forgotten it. She had not been snooping. She had been looking for a pen. She had pulled out the document, bound, printed, the kind of formal internal document that companies produce for their boards, and she had opened it because she was 12 and curious and had never been able to leave an unread document alone since she had learned to read. She had read the entire thing at the kitchen table over 2 hours, with a glass of orange juice and a pencil she had found in the kitchen drawer, making small notes in the margin in her careful 12-year-old handwriting. When her father came back for the briefcase at noon, he had found her still at the table, the quarterly report open in front of her, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something unexpected and said, "What are you doing?" "Reading this," she had said. The gross margin on the automotive contract is lower than the previous quarter, but the volume is significantly higher. I think the margin compression is worth it if the volume holds, but if the automotive manufacturer renegotiates in 2 years the way it says in the footnotes it might, the margin compression becomes a problem. Did you model that? Marcus Calloway had stood in his kitchen doorway and looked at his 12-year-old daughter for a long moment. Then he had taken the report, put it in his briefcase and said, "That's not something you need to worry about." He had gone back to the office. He had not told her she was right. He had not told her he had, in fact, modeled exactly that scenario and that her read was correct. He had not said anything about it at all. He had simply taken the document and left, and Serena had sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes after he was gone, looking at the place where the quarterly report had been, and she had felt, for the first time and not the last, the specific sensation of saying something true and watching it disappear. She had gone back to reading because what else was there to do? Derek was born the following year, and the family system reorganized itself around him with the completeness and efficiency of a system that had been waiting for this specific input. He was a beautiful baby and an easy toddler and a charming child, and Marcus Calloway had looked at his son from the beginning with the warm, uncomplicated recognition of a man seeing himself reflected, not in the analytical, detail-obsessed way of Serena, which was too focused, too interior, too much like something that needed to be managed rather than celebrated, but in the easy, magnetic, socially fluent way that Marcus had been in his 20s before the company had consumed all of that energy and left only the work. Derek was what Marcus had been before the weight of building something real had required him to become something harder. He loved his son for this with the full, uncritical love of someone who does not examine what they love or why. Serena he loved differently. This is not a comfortable thing to say, and it was not a comfortable thing to grow up inside of, but it was true, and Serena had known it was true since she was approximately 7 years old, which is earlier than a child should have to understand something that complicated about the people who are supposed to be their foundation. He loved her with the qualified, distracted love of someone who admires a quality they do not quite know what to do with. He thought she was intelligent. He was proud of her academically in the distant way of parents who treat their children's achievements as evidence of their own genetic quality, rather than as things that belong to the child. He did not know her favorite book or her closest friend or what she was afraid of or what she wanted from her life beyond the company, because he had never asked in a way that required a real answer, and she had learned early that offering a real answer without being asked produced nothing but the mild discomfort of a man encountering information he has not requested. Her mother Patricia was warmer in surface temperature, and no more perceptive in substance. Patricia Calloway had been, before her marriage, a woman of considerable social intelligence and genuine personal elegance, and she had redirected those qualities entirely into the project of being Marcus Calloway's wife, which was a substantial and consuming project and which she executed with genuine skill and real commitment. She loved her children with the demonstrative, physical warmth of a woman who had been raised to believe that love expressed through presence and food and physical affection was sufficient love, and she was not wrong that this was love. It was. But it was love that had never required her to see her daughter as a specific person with specific qualities and specific needs rather than as a role in the family system. Serena was the older child. Serena was the serious one. Serena was capable. Patricia used this word constantly, with the specific tone of a woman who considers capability a complete description rather than a starting point. Capable meant handled. Capable meant fine on her own. Capable meant that Patricia's attention and concern could be directed elsewhere toward Derek, who needed more managing, more encouraging, more of the specific active support that Patricia was good at providing. The family had moved from Pittsburgh to Greenwich when Serena was 15 and Derek was 12. When Callaway Industries had grown large enough to require a New York presence and Marcus had decided that presence should be residential as well as professional. The Greenwich estate was 12,000 square feet on 4 acres, with a gate and a long driveway and the kind of understated, serious architectural presence that old Connecticut money favored. Not showy, but impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. Serena had her own bedroom, her own bathroom, a desk where she did her homework, a view of the back gardens. She had everything she needed materially and the specific loneliness of a person who is surrounded by family and known by none of them. She had gone to Yale because she had earned it completely on her own with grades and scores and an application essay that her college counselor had told her, after reading it, was the best she had seen in 20 years of college counseling, which was a compliment that her parents had received with the mild, distant pride of people hearing confirmation of something they had already assumed rather than something they had genuinely invested in. Derek had gone to Dartmouth 3 years later, to a celebration dinner at the Greenwich estate with 20 guests that Serena had attended in the role of supportive older sister, and which no one had thought to note was different in scale or enthusiasm from the quiet dinner for 4 that had marked her own Yale acceptance. She had come back from Yale with a business degree and a precise, comprehensive understanding of financial analysis, corporate strategy, and the specific mechanics of industrial businesses that she had developed partly in her coursework and partly in the independent study she had done since she was 12 because the subject was genuinely interesting, and she had never needed external motivation to pursue things that interested her. She had come back wanting to work at Callaway Industries in the operations division, where she had spent 2 summers in college doing actual work, not decorative work, not the kind of intern project that produces a report no one reads, but genuine operational analysis that the division directors had used because it was correct and useful and produced by someone who understood what she was looking at. Marcus had given her communications. "You have a way with people," he had said, at the dinner table where the conversation about her role had taken place, in the specific tone of a man delivering a decision rather than having a discussion. "The company needs someone who can represent it well. You're good at that." "I want to work in operations," Serena had said. "I've spent 2 summers there. I understand the supply chain. I understand the margin structure. I understand where the inefficiencies." "Communications," Marcus had said, with the finality of someone who has already stopped listening. "It's important work. You'll be good at it." Patricia had nodded from the other end of the table with the expression of a woman confirming a decision that had been made before anyone sat down. Serena had looked at her father. She had looked at her mother. She had looked at Derek, who was 21 and had just been given a role in business development, a role with client contact and deal exposure and the specific visibility that builds careers, and who was eating his dinner with the comfortable unconcern of someone whose path has been arranged for them and who has never had reason to question whether the arrangement was fair. She had said nothing further. She had picked up her fork and continued eating, and she had thought, with the cold, precise clarity that was her most reliable internal instrument, "I will build what I need to build. I will do it quietly, and I will wait for the right moment." She had been 22 years old. She had not yet known exactly what she was going to build or precisely how the moment would arrive. But she had known, with the specific certainty of someone who has been studying a problem long enough to understand its fundamental structure, that the moment would come, that it was simply a matter of preparation and patience, and the willingness to do what needed to be done without requiring anyone to watch her do it. The communications division had been, under the previous director, A competent but uninspired operation, press releases drafted in corporate language that conveyed nothing, investor communications that were technically accurate and emotionally inert, a public presence for Callaway Industries that reflected the company's genuine substance about as accurately as a blurry photograph. Serena had spent 6 months learning what was broken, and then 3 years fixing it with the same methodical, precise attention she brought to everything. She rewrote the investor communication framework from the ground up. She built a media relationships program that resulted in the first substantive long-form coverage Callaway Industries had received in a national financial publication. She developed a crisis communication protocol that was used, 8 months after she created it, when a supplier failure caused a production delay that could have become a significant reputational problem, and instead became a case study in how to communicate transparently and maintain client trust through operational disruption. The CEO of the client company whose production had been affected sent Marcus Callaway a handwritten note afterward saying that Callaway Industries' handling of the situation had made him more confident in the relationship, not less. Marcus had shared the note at a leadership team meeting. He had credited the communications team. He had not said Serena's name. She had heard this from the CFO, who mentioned it in passing, without any apparent awareness that it was a significant thing to mention. Meanwhile, Derek was accumulating titles: Business Development Director, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, Senior Vice President of Corporate Development. Each title came with increasing visibility and the family's increasingly public endorsement and the specific, growing weight of assumption that he was being groomed for something. He was, by any honest accounting, adequate in each role, genuinely good at the relationship-building aspects, genuinely poor at the analytical ones, genuinely dependent on the support infrastructure that Marcus had arranged around him and that everyone in the company understood was there, and that no one mentioned because some things are understood without being said. He closed deals that had been substantially structured by the time they reached his desk. He managed client relationships with the easy social fluency that was his genuine gift. He contributed. He was not exceptional. He also spoke to Serena, in the privacy of family occasions, in ways that she cataloged with the careful, unemotional precision of a woman who has learned that the things people say when they believe they are safe are the most accurate data available. "You're the smartest person in most rooms you walk into," he had said at a family dinner 3 years ago, the Chateau Margaux open, their parents present, his tone the specific warm condescension of someone delivering what they consider a compliment but that reveals in its structure exactly what they actually think. But there's smart and there's leadership, and those are genuinely different things. I think Dad sees that. I think you do too if you're honest. Serena had looked at him across the table. She had said, She had refilled her wine glass. "I'm not trying to be unkind," Derek had continued, with the ease of someone who has never had to consider whether their unkindness requires their intention. "I'm being honest. You've built something real in communications. That matters. Not everyone needs to run the whole thing to matter." Patricia had nodded from her end of the table with the expression of someone confirming a truth they consider self-evident. Marcus had said nothing. He had looked at his wine glass. He had been looking at his wine glass more often in those years when these conversations happened, not because he disagreed exactly, but because something in him, some assessment that he had not yet named or acted on, had begun producing a low-level discomfort that manifested as a sudden interest in the contents of whatever glass he was holding. The thing that Marcus had been doing with that discomfort, the thing no one at the table knew, the thing that was quietly, invisibly, permanently changing the shape of everything, was that he had been talking to Howard Price. Howard Price was 72 years old, a private equity veteran from Pittsburgh, who had backed Callaway Industries in its second year with $800,000 and a handshake, and the specific conviction of a man who has spent 40 years identifying people who understand what they are doing. He had been the company's first outside investor and its most consistently perceptive board observer, a man who said very little in board meetings and whose silence was more expensive than other people's speeches because everyone in the room knew that when Howard did speak, what he said would be exactly right. He had known Serena since she was 8 years old. He had watched her at family events and company functions and the occasional board meeting that Marcus had allowed both children to observe from the back of the room when they were teenagers, as a form of education. He had watched her with the focused, quietly excited attention of someone who recognizes something rare and is trying to understand exactly what they are looking at. 9 years ago, Howard had called Serena on a Tuesday afternoon. Not her father. Not the family. Serena. On her cell phone, which he had obtained from the company directory and which she was surprised, the first time she saw his name on her screen, that he had. She had answered. He had asked her to come to his Pittsburgh office at her earliest convenience. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has decided to do something he has been considering for a long time, and is ready to stop considering and start doing. She had flown to Pittsburgh the following Thursday. His office was in a building he owned outright on the 14th floor, with a view of the Allegheny River and walls of books that ran from floor to ceiling and had the particular density of shelves that have been assembled by someone who read everything on them. He had poured coffee. He had looked at her across his desk with the direct, unhedging assessment of a man who had spent a career evaluating people, and had long since stopped bothering with preamble when he knew what he wanted to say. "I read the memo you wrote at 17, he said, about the supplier margins. Your father showed it to me." He paused. "He didn't tell you he showed it to me. He didn't tell you that I told him it was one of the most perceptive pieces of operational analysis I had seen from someone with full access to the company in 20 years of sitting on his board. He didn't tell you any of that." Serena looked at him. She was 32 years old and she had spent 20 years being the quiet one and the serious one and the capable one and the one who did not get told things. And she sat across from Howard Price in his Pittsburgh office with his view of the Allegheny River, and she felt, moving through her with the force of something long compressed finally finding space, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was closest to the feeling of being seen accurately by someone for the first time in a context where the seeing actually had consequences. "No," she said. "He didn't tell me. I've been watching you for 25 years, Howard said. "I've watched what you've built in that communications division. I've watched what you understand about this company that other people in leadership positions don't understand. I've watched your brother too, and he is a decent man with genuine strengths in specific areas, and running a $2.8 billion industrial company is not among them." He set down his coffee cup. "I am 72 years old and I have 18% of Callaway Industries and no interest in holding it into my 80s. I want to transfer it to someone who will do something real with it. I want to transfer it to you." Serena sat very still for a moment. "What are the terms?" Howard almost smiled. The fact that her first response was terms rather than any of the emotional responses another person might have had, gratitude, protest, overwhelm, confirmed for him what he had known for 25 years. Fair market value, structured over 3 years to align with your cash flow. And your promise, which I'll take on your word because I've been watching you for 25 years and I know what your word is worth, that you'll run this company the way it deserves to be run after your father steps back. "And my father?" she asked. "Your father is a complicated man who has made a significant error of judgment regarding his children," Howard said, with the neutral precision of someone delivering an assessment rather than a verdict. "I am not asking for his permission. I am doing a legal transaction with a consenting adult. What he does with the information when it becomes available to him is his own business." He paused. "The question is what you want to do." She had not answered immediately. She had sat with the question for 30 seconds, which was for Serena Callaway a long time, looking at the view of the Allegheny River, which was going gold in the late afternoon light, which looked from this distance like something her father might have looked at 35 years ago when he was building something from nothing and every decision felt like it cost more than he knew he had. She thought about the kitchen table and the quarterly report and the pen she had been looking for. She thought about the 2 summers in operations and the communications division and the dinner table and the wine glass her father looked into when he did not want to meet her eyes. She thought about 37 years of being managed into the margins of a room she was born in. She said, "I want to do it." What followed over the next 4 years was the most demanding and the most invisible project of Serena Callaway's professional life. Howard's 18% was the foundation. Above it she constructed, with the precision and patience of someone who understood that every piece of this needed to be legally unassailable and publicly invisible until she chose otherwise, the remainder of what she needed. There were 3 other early Callaway investors, men in their late 60s and early 70s who had backed Marcus in the early years, and who held small positions they had been meaning to liquidate and who trusted Howard's judgment about the right buyer. She approached each of them through Howard's introduction and her own direct, unhedging way of speaking to people who understood what she was actually proposing, and she purchased each position at fair market value through an entity, Callaway SC Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, managed by an attorney in Philadelphia named Claire Nakamura, who was not the Callaway family attorney, and who had the specific combination of technical expertise and complete discretion that the situation required. She funded it with the earnings she had accumulated over 15 years of corporate salary plus performance bonuses that her communications division had warranted, but that she had never spent on the Greenwich lifestyle she could have had. She lived in a clean, well-appointed apartment in the West Village. She drove a 4-year-old Audi. She wore excellent clothes bought thoughtfully and kept for years. She did not own a weekend house or a boat or any of the other artifacts of Upper East Side. Aspiration that she could have afforded and had simply never wanted, plus a line of credit arranged independently through a relationship banker at a private bank in Midtown who had been introduced to her by a client of the communications division, and who processed the financing with the professional neutrality of someone who evaluates creditworthiness rather than family dynamics. She crossed 50% on a Thursday in March, at 11:14 in the morning, when Claire called her from Philadelphia to confirm that the final transfer had cleared. Serena was at her desk in the Callaway Industries communications suite, the office that was notably not in the corner, the one with the window that looked at the side of another building rather than the Midtown skyline, reviewing a press release about a new subsidiary acquisition. She had received the call. She had said, "Thank you, Claire. Please file the Schedule 13D within the required window." She had ended the call. She had sat for a moment looking at the press release on her desk, the press release about someone else's acquisition, at a company that was technically hers, and then she had put the call out of her mind and finished the press release, because there was work to do and the moment for what came next had not yet arrived. She filed the Schedule 13D 7 months before the gala. Filed it correctly, completely on the required SEC timeline, as any controlling shareholder was legally required to do. The filing was public. All Schedule 13D filings are public, that is the point of them, but public in the way that things are public when they are technically available and practically invisible, buried in SEC databases that nobody reads unless they are looking for something specific. Her father's team was not looking for something specific. Her father's team had no reason to search SEC filings for Serena Callaway's name in connection with their own company, because Serena Callaway was the communications director who had worked in the office with the window looking at the side of another building for 15 years, and who everyone understood was capable and handled and fine on her own. Nobody searches for what they have already decided is not there. She did not tell Daniel until the night before the gala. She had called him into her office at 7 in the evening, when the floor was empty and the Midtown skyline outside her window had gone from amber to dark, and she had handed him the drive and told him what it contained and what she needed him to do and exactly when she needed him to have done it. Daniel had been her assistant for 6 years, and he had the specific quality of someone who is excellent at their job, partly because they have long since stopped being surprised by anything. He had taken the drive. He had looked at her for a moment. He had said, 6:45 tomorrow. I'll confirm when it's done. She had said, "Thank you, Daniel." He had nodded and left, and she had sat in the empty office for a few more minutes looking at the Midtown skyline through the window that looked at the side of another building, and she had thought, tomorrow. The morning of the gala she had dressed with the specific, quiet attention she brought to things that mattered. The Roland Mouret dress had been bought 3 months ago, held in her closet, worn once to confirm the fit and returned to its garment bag to wait. Her hair she had done herself. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She had learned early that if you wanted something done exactly right, you should learn to do it yourself. Her makeup was done by a woman named Isabel who had been doing it for 4 years and who understood, without needing to be told again, that Serena wanted precision and not decoration. She had eaten breakfast at her kitchen table in the West Village with black coffee, and the morning papers and the specific internal steadiness of someone who has been preparing for something for 9 years, and is not going to be rushed by proximity to its arrival. She had called her closest friend, a woman named Adrian, a corporate attorney she had met at a Yale alumni event 12 years ago, and who was one of perhaps 4 people in the world who knew the full architecture of what Serena had built and what she intended to do with it, and she had said, "Tonight." Adrian had said, "I know. I'll be at my phone." Serena had said, "Thank you." Adrian had said, "You have been ready for this for 20 years. Go do it." Serena had ended the call and put her phone in her evening bag beside the drive and gone to meet the car. The drive from the West Village to the Grand Hyatt had taken 22 minutes in evening traffic. She had spent them looking out the window at the city going past, the lights of Midtown coming up ahead of her, the city dense and alive and indifferent in the way of cities that have seen everything before, and she had thought about her father's voice saying Derek's name into the microphone that was still live, and the 300 guests raising their glasses and the drive in her bag and the projector waiting and the screen that was going to show 300 people what was true. She had felt no anxiety. She had felt, sitting in the back of the car with the city going past, something she recognized as readiness, the specific physical readiness of someone arriving at a moment they have been moving toward for a very long time. Daniel had confirmed at 6:47, synced and ready. She had walked into the Grand Hyatt ballroom at 7:15 and taken her place at the head table, for seats from the end, in the chair of careful management, and she had set the remote control on the table beside her untouched champagne flute and she had waited, with the patience of someone for whom patience had long since stopped being an effort and had become simply the way she existed in time, for her father to say the words. He said them at 9:17, and she stood and she walked to the projector and she pressed the button. The screen showed her name and her percentage and the filing date, and the entity structure in clean, unambiguous, SEC standard documentation that any corporate attorney in the room could read in 3 minutes and understand completely. She watched it hit the room. She watched 300 people reorganize their understanding of what they were witnessing. She watched her father's face go through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion, then the beginning of comprehension, then something that was trying to be authority and was not finding the footing for it. She watched Derek standing with his champagne flute halfway to his lips, and his face doing something complicated and irreversible. She watched the two financial journalists reach for their phones simultaneously with the synchronized instinct of people who understand they are in the room where the story is happening. "What is this?" Marcus said into the still live microphone. His voice had changed. The authority was still in it, the muscle memory of a man who had commanded rooms for 30 years, but underneath it something had shifted, something foundational, and everyone in the room could hear the shift. "This is the shareholder record," Serena said. Her voice was pleasant, clear, caring, current as of last quarter's SEC filing. "I have been the majority shareholder of Callaway Industries for 7 months." She looked at her father, not with cruelty and not with triumph but with the full, direct gaze of someone who has nothing left to manage and nowhere left to stand except exactly where she is. "I own the company, Dad, and I thought, since we were all here together for this occasion, that this was the right moment for everyone to have accurate information." Derek had set down his champagne flute. "How?" His voice was the voice of a man speaking through the specific shock of having a future he believed was certain revealed as something that was never his to begin with. "How does she, Dad?" Marcus Callaway stepped back from the podium. The microphone was still in his hand and he looked at it for a moment as though he was not entirely certain what it was. He set it on the podium. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the screen behind her. He looked at his daughter again. Something was happening on his face that Serena could see, and that was, she understood, the beginning of the longest and most difficult reckoning of Marcus Callaway's life. The reckoning of a man who had built something real and had looked at the two people who might carry it forward and had seen one of them clearly and the other not at all, and had spent 37 years making every decision from that flawed foundation, and was only now, in a Grand Hyatt ballroom in front of 300 people, beginning to understand what it had cost. The gala did not recover its original atmosphere. It continued. The infrastructure of hospitality runs on its own momentum, even after the emotional center has collapsed. But the succession announcement was the last word anyone spoke about Derek Callaway's future at Callaway Industries that evening. Derek left early at 10:15, with Candace's hand on his arm and the expression of a man who has had something ended that he thought was just beginning. Patricia found Serena near the bar at 10:45 and stood beside her without speaking for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "I didn't know." Serena had said, "I know." And that was as far as that conversation went. Marcus found her at 11 o'clock, when the room was thinning and the catering staff was beginning the quiet work of clearing. He had aged in the 2 hours since the announcement in the specific way that proud men age when something they believed was permanent has proven not to be. Something in the quality of how he occupied space had contracted, become less certain of its own right to fill the room. He stood in front of his daughter without his drink, without the ease he had worn all evening. He said, "Howard always said you were the one. From the beginning." He paused. "I told him he was wrong." "Howard was right," Serena said. "Howard was right," Marcus said. And then, "I know I owe you more than that." "You do," she said. "But that's a conversation for another time." She looked at him, her father, complicated and flawed and genuinely brilliant about some things and genuinely blind about others, a man she had loved and been hurt by and respected and been dismissed by, a man she would spend years in the patient, unresolvable work of understanding more completely than she currently did. "Get some rest, Dad. The board meeting is Thursday. I'll need you there." She walked out of the Grand Hyatt ballroom at 11:23 in her Roland Mouret dress with her evening bag on her wrist and the drive inside it and the midtown air hitting her face when she came through the doors, cold and sharp and carrying the specific smell of the city at night, which to Serena Holloway smelled in this moment like everything that was about to begin. The board meeting on Thursday confirmed what the Schedule 13D had already established in law. Gerald Osei, the lead independent director, had called it the morning after the gala at Serena's request, and with the efficiency of a man who had spent the previous night reviewing the shareholder documentation and arrived at the only conclusion a competent director could arrive at. The agenda had one item. The vote was 7-1. Her father voted against, not out of malice but out of the specific, painful process of a man accepting a correction that was permanent and comprehensive, and that required more than 48 hours to metabolize into grace. She moved into the corner office on the following Monday. She did it quietly, with Daniel's help, transferring the contents of her desk from the office with the window looking at the side of another building to the office with the window looking at all of Midtown, and she stood for a moment at the corner window before she sat down and she looked at the city spread out ahead of her, and she thought about her father standing at that podium and about Howard Price on the phone on a Tuesday afternoon and about the kitchen table and the quarterly report and the pen she had been looking for when she was 12 years old, and she thought, here. This is where it begins. Derek took a leave of absence in January. He came back in March in a role that was defined by what he was actually good at rather than what the family story had required him to be: client relationships, deal origination, the easy social fluency that was his genuine gift when it wasn't being asked to substitute for something it couldn't be. He was not his sister's closest ally. He was not her enemy either. He was a man who had been humbled by something he could not argue with, which is one of the more useful things that can happen to a person, and he was gradually and with the specific adjustment of someone doing real work on something real, becoming a functional colleague and eventually something that resembled at a careful distance a brother. The supply chain restructuring that Serena implemented in her first 8 months, the initiative she had been designing in her head for 3 years, while she ran the communications division from the office with the wrong window, reduced operational costs by $31 million in the first year. The CFO presented the number at the next board meeting with the expression of a man revising several previous assumptions simultaneously. 2 underperforming subsidiaries were divested at terms that the investment banking advisors described as aggressive and correct. 3 operational directors were promoted from within, all of them people Serena had been watching for years and waiting for the authority to elevate. The company's institutional investor base, which had been quietly cautious in the years of assumed Derek's succession, began expanding. Howard Price died the following spring. Serena spoke at his memorial, private 20 people, the kind Howard would have chosen, and said, "He saw me before I had the language to describe what he was seeing. He did not wait for the world to catch up. He acted on what he knew." She stood at the small podium in Howard's Pittsburgh office with its walls of books and its view of the Allegheny River, and she felt the weight of what he had done for her and the impossibility of thanking someone adequately for the thing that changed everything. And she stood there for 1 extra second, just one, and then she finished what she had to say. She ran Callaway Industries the way her father had run it at his best and the way she had been preparing to run it for 20 years, with the relentless, precise attention of someone who understands that the difference between a good business and a great one is almost always made at 2 in the morning in the middle of a crisis that nothing could have prepared you for specifically, but everything you have ever learned prepared you for generally. She made hard decisions without hedging them. She was honest with her people about what she knew and what she didn't. She was in the plants and the logistics centers and the supplier facilities with the regularity of someone who still believed, as her father had believed at his best, that you could not run something you did not understand from the inside. She had the Schedule 13D framed and hung on the wall behind her desk in the corner office. Not as a trophy, not as a declaration, as a document, as the piece of paper that said, in the language of law and public record, what had been true for a very long time and was now simply, officially undeniable, that she had understood this from the beginning, that she had been ready from the beginning, that the story had always been hers, that it had taken her father saying the wrong name into a live microphone in front of 300 people for the world to finally catch up to what was already true. She sat at the corner desk every morning with black coffee and operational reports and the view of Midtown opening ahead of her in the particular early light that belongs to people awake enough to see it, and she worked and she built, and she did not waste a single moment of it looking back at anything that was already finished. The company was hers. The work was real. The window had the right view. Everything else was just the world catching up, which it always does eventually, for people who are patient enough and precise enough and willing enough to build what they need to build without waiting for anyone's permission to begin.